On April 3rd, 1860, the first rider, a guy named Johnson Richardson, left St. Joseph with the instructions, the mail must go through. East and westbound riders then crossed on April 8th, 1860, and on April 13th, Richardson, making a return run, arrived with the first letters from San Francisco. Here you see an ad for the Pony Express, and you can see down here, it weren't cheap. I mean, they make FedEx prices look like a bargain. $1 to send a letter here is very expensive. In October 1861, telegraph wires were connected, and suddenly the Pony Express was out of business overnight. Having made 300 runs each way, carrying 35,000 pieces of mail, over 616,000 total miles covered. And yet, all of the Pony Express riders were unemployed overnight, downsized 100%. What happened to them? Well, this is where history gives us some interesting evidence. And by the way, here's a couple of letters. One announcing Lincoln's election, and this Pony Express is written on tissue-thin paper. And on top of the $1 charge, the government required a 10-cent stamp. So Uncle Sam still got his money after all of this. What happened to these riders? Well, a pair of historians, Raymond and Mary Settle, wrote a book called Saddles and Spurs. They tracked down virtually all of the riders in history. Don Rising, after carrying the mail for the Union Army, got several promotions to be assistant wagon master of the U.S. Army. He eventually moved to New Mexico and started a great hotel. Harry Roth became an insurance salesman so successful he was named to be the Pacific manager of the home insurance company. Elijah Maxfield, Happy Tom Ranahan, Robert Pony Bob Haslett. These guys all had great names, right? You had to have a nickname if you're a Pony Express, right? You know, little Jimmy Joe Bob Jr. Smith. And others became involved in stagecoach driving or scouting. Martin Hogan used his knowledge of the trails to plan paths for the railroads. John Fry, Johnson Richardson's others worked in rodeos. Every rider that the Settles were able to track down, and they got all of them, but one who ended up a hermit, every one of them ended up, over the long haul, in a better line of work. No, they weren't making $25 a week, but again, you can only do that for a few years as a rider. Meanwhile, the new telegraphs, the stage lines, the railroads added thousands of jobs in the West, creating vast new wealth and founding countless cities. Moreover, the telegraph and the railroad improved productivity, so the prices for transportation of all goods, not just letters, fell. In short, the riders of the Pony Express found that they had, in essence, created their own jobs with their skills and their determination. And that's the first lesson I have for students. You are your own employer. You may think that somebody else is going to, quote, give you a job. In reality, you are your own employers. What you can do for someone else, giving them a service or a product, that's how you ensure your job future, that's how you ensure your employment future, is always find a way to be of productive service to your fellow man. However, I do think that if the news media of today was around back in the 1860s, we probably would have gotten a headline something like that. Now this brings me to the second part of my talk, which is that most business history books, and indeed most U.S. history textbooks, to the extent that they deal with the economy at all, take this corporate killers approach, and they certainly do not revisit the impact on the overall economy to see what growth had taken place in new sectors. They prefer instead to focus on the dislocations of the economy, on the unemployed, on the problems. So let me shift gears. Or in keeping with my Pony Express motif, let me change horses, and let's look a little bit at how mainstream U.S. history books deal with bias. As any historian knows, you cannot avoid bias in history. It involves selecting this fact over that fact. You think you've written an objective book, but merely by the fact that you're including 2 paragraphs discussion on Martin Luther King Jr. over 2 paragraphs discussion on, say, Ulysses Simpson Grant, you are changing the makeup of the textbook a little bit. You're changing how you cover the past. So, one common method of putting bias in textbooks is to slant the narrative through narrowing or widening the focus. The greatness of America can be diminished if one can constrict the focus to, say, only slavery, or only on the subjugation of the Plains Indians, or only on the internment of the Japanese in World War II. So the job of the historian is to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Sadly, this is lacking in discussions of the Great Depression and the New Deal. Briefly, my book, A Patriot's History of the United States, not only examines the causes of the Great Depression, primarily the failings of the Federal Reserve System, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, and government, not business, and Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal programs designed to combat the Depression. However, while many books, to one degree or another, assess the success or lack thereof of Roosevelt's programs to get us out of the Depression, none of them ever looked at the long-term impact of those policies. These same authors would have no trouble looking at the long-term impact of the end of Reconstruction, for example. What is the long-term impact of the New Deal programs? We can just take a couple. Most common one that comes to mind, Social Security. Surveys show that most of you would be more likely to believe in UFOs than that you are going to ever see a Social Security check. I just heard a statistic today that said that by 2050, the entire budget of the United States government will be going for just the interest on our debt. Just the interest. That's primarily Medicare and Social Security. When Social Security was started as a fund, it was designed to have 14 workers paying into the system for every 1 worker taking out. Today, my mother receives Social Security. Those of you who have a job, I want to thank you. Every 3 of you paying in help pay her 1 Social Security. When you get ready to retire, there will be 1 person paying in for every 3 of you taking out. This is not one of the things that's ever looked at when historians look at the New Deal. But it was a program created in the New Deal that is going to come back to bite us in the tail section soon if we don't do something about it. There's many others. In A Patriot's History of the United States, Mike Allen and I have 2 pages of New Deal programs with their intended objective, and then on the right side, something no other book has ever done, we have a 50-year view of what those programs actually did in terms of their long-term impact. The AAA farm policies, for example, resulted in an inefficient system of farm subsidies, finally had to be repealed in the 1990s. Most financial experts would agree that the Glass-Steagall Act has had a detrimental effect on American banking. The Minimum Wage Act, while not nearly as important an issue today as it was 3 decades ago, at one time was the biggest single impediment to the hiring of blacks and other minorities in this country. None of these outcomes are ever discussed in the context of the New Deal. If you're going to tell the truth, tell the whole truth. But that brings me to my pet peeve in these textbooks, Reagan and the Reagan era.